work every other year.
Oh, that's a great idea.
You know, like a year's worth of work every other year.
All right, well,
We follow up with Lance.
we'll go ahead and get started here. Do we have anyone on the line? No one yet? Okay, I'll check. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding AO 2022-83, allowing use of relocatable ancillary buildings as emergency shelters for persons experiencing homelessness. It is Friday, September 23, 2022. We're scheduled from 3:20 to 4:20 p.m. Documents for this work session are available online at muni.org/worksessions. We'll go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions for the record.
Felix Rivera.
Pete
Daniel
Peterson.
Boland. Oh, whoops. You skipped me, Pete. Daniel Boland.
Pete Peterson.
Christopher Constant.
Suzanne LaFrance. And then do we have any members online?
Yes, Kevin Cross.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cross. Anyone else? Okay. And we are joined by members of the administration.
Adam Trombley.
Quincy Arms.
And we also have Larry Baker and Bryce Wilbanks as well. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Trombley.
Sure, appreciate it. So, I mean, obviously, most of you know in the past, I like to work collaboratively on code changes with you before they actually get on the agenda. This was a little bit different due to timing, availability. So, just a quick history on this is the Anchorage School District approached the municipality and said, hey, we have a bunch of relocatables. Relocatables, everybody knows they're used at schools. Kids are use them for additional classrooms. They have, I can't remember exactly how many, but a considerable amount. And they asked if the municipality would be interested in assuming those. They were willing to give them to us for free. And so for the purpose of housing homeless. So before we said yes, we took a deep dive in the code to see if we could even use them for that. And the answer was no. But however, relocatables have their own definition under Title 23.95. And so we were trying to find a way to allow these to be used. And so worked with Quincy on the language. And frankly, we were shocked to find that it would only take this one small change. I will turn it over to Quincy to help explain a little bit more on the details of how this would work and how it ties in 23 with 16.120. So I'll turn it over.
Okay. So the way that Title 23 works for relocatable buildings is currently it only allows them to be used for educational classrooms or support facilities meeting the Group E occupancy, and that just means for educational purposes. So what we did was create basically a subcategory. So we have the use as a educational classroom, and now we have the use as an emergency shelter. But it comes with conditions, and you'll see that in the language that the movable facility has to first be designated under the emergency shelter plan. So this can only ever be used when the emergency shelter plan has been activated.
And, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
And I also want to mention that these would still have to meet, fire approval, which they do, but, they'd have to, usually these relocatables, they're secured to the ground for seismic with cribbing. So they meet wind and seismic, those kind of things. So as far as being a structure that's a stable structure, they already do meet that requirement, and none of that would change. In fact, you can see above 300 and 23.95.200 the requirements associated with this. And then I can answer any questions because I'm sure there's a lot.
And I just want to pause to note for the record that we've been joined on the phone by Mr. Salt. So any questions for Mr. Trombley at this point? I don't see anyone in the queue. If you want to go ahead and continue.
Sure. obviously, some of the challenges with this is, where would they be utilized? You couldn't just put them in an open field. Fire would still have to sign off in the sense that, generally, fire trucks are around 80,000 pounds. So they'd have to be utilized on a location that has a parking lot, some sort of existing structure that an 80,000 pound fire truck could be used. The layout would be important. We could utilize a term contractor to design a layout architecturally for allowable fire access. These do not obviously have bathrooms and shower facilities. So there would be that additional component in order for housing. I think there's accessory units that could be utilized that allow or provide those services, bathroom services, shower services, those kind of things. And so identifying locations, we haven't really done a deep dive into any of those things. We did look at one location, the old archive site that does have, when you look at aerial maps, it does have parking lots. How many could fit on that? We're not entirely sure. We'd have to do the architectural. But again, we weren't going to really expend any resources and money to do that analysis until we knew the assembly was even open to allowing these.
Thank you, Mr. Trombley. Any questions? Mr. Constant?
Kind of, but not really. My standard question, have we conceptualized our rough order of magnitude operational plan? How would this operate? Because I understand we're here talking about the structures, but the biggest challenge to the structures in my mind being effective is how we would actually do this, because these strike me as the least best option, because they don't have bathrooms, they don't have anything but electric heat, they don't have kitchens. People are going to be wandering the sites, and so I'm just trying to figure that part out. What's our plan for the operation?
That's a great question, Mr. Constant. I'll be honest with you, I'm not an operational. I don't know. That's outside of my lane. That's outside of my wheelhouse and what I'm good at. This was more along the lines of, is this something that we're willing to do? And it may very well be not an option for this year that we could at least vote this change to allow us to use them. I mean, there's other things for consideration, right? Would facilities maintain these? What's the budget for maintenance? When they're not being used, where would we store them? So there's a whole host of challenges associated with this that really, and again, the operations, how that would work. I don't see this as an option this year. It's just that this would give us time to say, yes, school district will take 4 of them hypothetically, and then we would figure out the rest. And it may very well be that we can't do that.
So one more question. Do we know when these were manufactured?
I don't, but I can find out.
I would like to know. I had somebody make a comment about how that's like the ones when I was in middle school. I was not a young person, and I thought maybe it's like the ones or maybe it's actually the ones. And so before we take on something that's at the end of its useful life, we might want to know the actual details of how they were and where they were and when they were manufactured. What comes to mind are either the rotten old ones or the FEMA ones that became toxic and awful.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Next is Mr. Rivera, then Mr. Peterson, and then Mr. Volan.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure that I interpreted what Mr. Trombley stated accurately. So is it the administration's position that even if the assembly were to approve this ordinance, that the administration would not be in a position to actually use relocatables as emergency shelter for this upcoming winter?
I think it's reasonable to assume that there's a tremendous amount of information we have to find and do our due diligence on prior to actually utilizing them. How long that's going to take is hard to say, but I think a reasonable assumption would be that probably this year may not work with all the questions that we have unanswered.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And when I was in elementary school, they hadn't invented the idea of relocatable classrooms that I know of. And so I've actually never attended a class in one of these. And I'm wondering, what's the size of one of these? Are they all the same size? Do we know how many square feet?
I believe there's somewhere around 1,000 square feet, somewhere around 1,000 square feet.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Bullen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple questions. So on the first page, item A6, accessibility for the disabled. I'm just thinking potentially if these relocatable buildings don't have to have accessibility, that may present a challenge to some of the population that we would be looking to house. So just want to flag that. I will say for me, it's sort of tough. I think, just timeline wise, trying to get our emergency homeless shelter plan online ASAP. Conceptually with relocatables, if there was sort of like a really comprehensive plan and I knew a lot of the details about where they would go and like how that sort of community would function. I think that would be kind of a cool conversation to unpack. I know that there are cities who are doing, they're sort of building out these communities for the unhoused, and there's even specific products that are made, sort of to be relocatable, tiny houses, that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I think the details are important to me, just sort of in the context of everything else that we're looking at. Those are my only comments. Thank you.
If I could follow up. Sure. And I think that just goes to the need for a continual conversation about, there's a lot of questions that we probably haven't even thought of, that we haven't even answered. We're just, again, we're looking for long-term solutions, especially during cold weather sheltering, whether it's this year or next year. We know one thing, it's always going to get cold in the wintertime here. So, if we can use it as a long-term solution and take time over the next, 8-9 months and come up with an operations plan, we're happy to do that and work with the assembly on that kind of stuff. So I agree with you. A lot of questions that have to be answered.
Thank you, Mr. Volin. Actually, Mr. Volin's question made a question or caused a question for me on that item number 6, the accessibility for the disabled, provided a similar education program is offered. So this section is just specific to the school district here. I mean, just the mention of the similar education program.
Let's see if I can answer your question. The way that, so A6 would apply to even to the use as an emergency shelter. And so as it stands, we don't qualify for that exception because we don't have a similar education program offered in a permanent building accessible to the disabled. So as it stands, if you wanted to use a relocatable building as an emergency shelter, you would have to make it accessible.
I'm just confused about the similar education program piece. That's just specific to the school district. It's not, I mean, that doesn't apply to.
There's like an exception upon an exception upon an exception, which I mean, I had to read this 20 times before I understood it myself. So if you start at the top of A, the relocatable ancillary building shall comply with the provisions of the technical codes for new buildings or structures relating to fire, except I skipped a bunch of words, except the relocatable ancillary building is not required to have. So it would not be required to have 6, accessibility for the disabled, but only, provided that a similar education program is offered in a permanent building.
Wouldn't that be then a similar education or shelter? I mean, to make it relevant to this, the conditions under which the relocatable buildings could be used? Maybe I'm reading that wrong. And I know Chris wanted to comment.
If I might, I
It's a
think that
broad
if I
reading.
might, I think that it's a drafting error not to catch that line right there.
Mhm.
If the intent is to keep it parallel, you would similar education or emergency housing program, right? So there's a slight phrase missing there to make it accurate, but
Mhm.
I think the principle is also important to dive into the question of, we know we've been told that these will not be brought up to ADA compliance, and there's just no way to do it. And so what the alternative that exists here, when you assume they're placed on a location that has other school buildings, is that those individuals will receive education on site in those other places. And so it gets to the question that I have on this. And I've been in many conversations recently about accessibility related to ADA laws. And basically, I've been told you can't simply rely on a function that exists in another location for the required service that is supposed to be delivered on site to this, whatever it is. When I think about it, I think about those voting machines for people who have sight challenges that the state is wrestling over how to get them, and we are questioning ourselves. Like $30,000 each. I asked, can we do them just in one or two locations? And I'm told, no, you got to have them where the voters are. And so I don't understand the ADA laws enough to make a legal conclusion about what the path is to get from this code to what would be legal in the sense of the uses. And so my assumption would be, and I'm sorry I'm rambling, but my assumption would be that as long as we do have shelter that is accessible in a way that is reasonably close or whatever that standard is, then that might suffice. I don't know. And so that's a question I think we need an answer to, is what is the legal boundary around how we get to accessible? Because we have to have accessible or equitable or otherwise available shelter for people who can't climb the stairs when it's 20 below outside and it's covered in ice.
Yeah, I understand your question and I can look into it.
Thank you.
I
don't need
had an
answer.
amendment drafted, but it doesn't exactly address everything you just mentioned. So
Yeah, I would love to know the boundaries.
Thank you. Mr. Volan, did you want back in?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. Oh, it's okay. Any other questions from members? I am just curious if in your work on this, you have come across other jurisdictions who've used relocatable buildings. I think Mr. Volan mentioned something about that.
Yeah, there's a company called Pallet Shelter. You can go on their website, palletshelter.com, and they've started some of these communities where they're like these kind of little cottages, pop-up cottages. So I think there's maybe like an interesting model here. I would just, I think I would want like a presentation and more of an idea and a concept and like a plan. So I knew where we were trying to get more specifically, but yeah, conceptually, I think it's interesting, maybe worth exploring.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that, like, for me, I don't see necessarily any objection to using something that's relocatable to provide emergency shelter. It's more the operational side of it. And I know you mentioned, Adam, Mr. Trombley, that you all are still doing some work on that piece, but just in terms of staffing, and then of course the accessibility and where they would go. I think for me anyway, those are maybe concerns that are, as long as the safety aspects are addressed and met, and the accessibility pieces, it is that other part, I think. And then of course the locations, and as you mentioned, Chris, about the potential end of life and liabilities associated with taking on older assets and that. Ed?
So in the last several years, we've explored the idea of tiny homes, which this is like a cognate of, if you will, looking at the pallet, shelter, et cetera. And the previous wisdom that we came away with was that when you boil it all down, you go through all of the permitting and all of the construction and all of the siting and all of the other elements within the effort to get something like that. You land at a trailer park, or you land at a higher cost per unit than purchasing or building or converting other units. And so I would love it if you guys had the chance to do a little bit of investigation on the numbers, because the conclusions in the mid run, maybe not the short run, might drive a different question, right? And that question being, what is the best use of limited dollars to achieve housing units? And so I would love to have your analysis of the costs kind of as a package. And that's separate from this specific initiative, because these are being given to us. We're talking about them being temporary, but we also did bridge a conversation on tiny homes and other creative potential solutions. I just know that the last time we looked, it didn't add up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as long as we're looking at these buildings, we should check to see if the wheels are still operable on them. Because if we actually have to jack them up and move them on a rig, that would make it more expensive than just being able to pull them somewhere. And I mean, most of them have been sitting next to a school for a couple of decades, and haven't been moved. So the wheels might be just perfect, but then again, they might not. So.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, and if I get a nod in the back, that we did have a donation from a trucking company recommending being willing to move them for us. So, and I can't remember exactly who that was, but Mr. Baker will tell us.
Yes. Maybe a couple of questions that came up. The inventory that the school district has of these buildings is 53. That's what they gave us when I met with the folks over at the school district. And they were anticipating that likely that 20 of those would be available to us. They are, I think, in response to some of the questions about condition of them, they are in good condition. That's what we were told, without identifying which ones. As a result of all of the media and the press about this, a private firm came forward a couple of weeks ago, and a transportation company, and they offered to move the facilities to wherever that the assembly might designate that they think it would be a good fit for the community, free of charge. And that was obviously a very substantial donation. I think the school district pays when they move a building from one location to the other, and that's the reason for the relocatables, that they can move them to where the school population is, that it costs about $10,000. So if you just use the numbers, it's about a $200,000 contribution to the community if the assembly should decide that this is something that you want to get engaged in. So that was, and then more recently, the school board passed this, I think it was Tuesday night, I believe, and said that they're in concurrence to help out the situation. And if we decide that it isn't part of a plan that we would like to utilize in the near future or the long term, or we could get to the planning device, well, we were told that then the school district just intends to auction the buildings off. So there is no cost to the building. That's a donation on behalf of the school board. And now we've had a private firm come forward and offer to move the buildings for us. So, but like Mr. Trombley said, we're kind of in the very beginning of the process, and if you think it's something that if you, the assembly, think it's something that you would like us to pursue, and in concert with you, identify a site and then do a little engineering to see if it's applicable and what the additional needs are. We also are contacted by another private firm that have self-contained showers and restrooms in the facility. So they could be applicable to, they're a unit that's actually, they have 6 of them. They're actually used on the North Slope in Alaska for their housing needs. So there's a lot of component parts, but like Adam said, I think that the first step is the assembly interested? And if you're interested, then I think that we're fully committed to do the work. But if there isn't a interest level, well, there's no sense in us going through that. But so we've had the firm come forward and offer to move them for us. The school district has said we'd like to be part of your solution, and we think that it's applicable. So that's the background. Okay.
I did want to mention that the Title 21 requirements would not be necessary because this would be under an emergency under 16-120. Title 21 is waived. So zoning, stuff like that, certain requirements, landscaping, those kind of things are waived under an emergency order, 16-120.
And I want to note for the record that we've been joined by Ms. Allard and Kevin. Mr. Cross has a question, and then we'll go to Mr. Volin.
Yeah, so curious about these structures.
And could you speak up a little bit, Kevin? It's hard to hear you.
Oh, yeah, here, let me. Am I coming through a little bit better now?
Much better, thanks.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't have any opposition to this ordinance or this code change to allow for these temporary structures in an emergency situation. I am curious about the structures themselves, though. If they don't have bathrooms and they're just annex buildings that are currently used for education purposes, I'm kind of curious on how much we're paying for them and where we're going to store them. And I don't know if those conversations taken place, but I mean, if you're just looking for a mobile building that you can buy a used mobile home for $35,000 to $45,000. It's got a bathroom and probably still has the wheels on it from any of the many mobile home parks around town. So I'd like to know more about these just out of curiosity. And do you know how much they're intending to purchase these, if these being given to us and it's just a code change? If you could elaborate, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Cross, Mr. Baker has done a phenomenal negotiating job, and the Anchorage School District has been agreed to a price of $0 for these. So they would be free, which is nice. But again, as I said in my opening remarks, again, there is a tremendous amount of due diligence that has to be done, such as where would we store them? And I do not have the answer, but that's one of the things that we are in the process of researching.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Larry, for negotiating such a great deal on these. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Mr. Volin?
Thank you. So I guess I just want to ask about timeline then, because I will say at this point, I'm not interested, again, conceptually in something like this. But so, if we don't take these 20 of these 53 buildings, then the school board is going to otherwise auction them off. Are we under the gun on that? Or is this, we've said that they're not going to be ready for this winter. Just kind of walk me through how much time we have to figure this out.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Vaughn, I don't think that we're under any pressure to say, well, by next Friday we have to. I think that whatever the assembly deems, if you say, well, please go back to the school district and say that we'd like to consider this option, but we have some questions that we need to figure out internally, and we'll give you a date by, pick a date, whatever you might feel would be comfortable. I think that the school district and the school board just wants to help, and they perceive that this was a way to help
Got it.
because it's a community issue. So I would not, I would have no hesitation to going back to the school board or the superintendent and says, we would like this amount of time to analyze to see if it will fit in our long-range planning to help the overall community. And this is when so you kind of, I think, Madam Chairman, the way that I would say this is you kind of tell us, and then we're happy to go back to the school board and say, the assembly would like this and give us this amount of time, and this is what they want us to do so that you can make a decision. And there's ways to do that within an ordinance. You could amend the ordinance to say whatever you want to say. And so we will, we will do whatever, if you decide that this is a good idea and gives us some flexibility in the long run, and you can sunset things. You have all kinds of vehicles, but this is kind of the first step in that process. And then you tell us what you would like, and we'll go get it. How's that?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Folan. Mr. Trombley, you and I had talked a little bit about number 4 and 5 about the fire alarm system and fire sprinkler system, and that while these would not have a system that's wired in, can you speak to what kinds of safety systems or mitigation there would be? I think you mentioned smoke alarms.
That's correct. These buildings would still be required to have CO2 smoke alarms. They would just not be required to have a fire sprinkler system.
Thank you. Chris or Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. This is the conversation in which these buildings have one door and they may need 2. And so there might be some modifications.
Wisconsin, some have 2.
Okay, right.
And until we did look at that, because precisely you need 2 entrances. Where they don't have two, there is a window in that general area of the building, so the modifications were fairly insignificant. Of course, if we have a request list, and if they're going to dispose of all 53, our request would be,
We keep the 2 doors.
please keep us the ones that have 2 doors.
Okay, so my first, just a brief lighthearted comment that when you are offered such a great deal, it often demands that you have a higher level of scrutiny, right?
Yes.
Because you don't know what they're actually going to pass off to you. And not that ASD is a bad operator, but I've done enough deals where if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So that's a principle of due diligence that's pretty important. And the question that comes to mind now, having heard there's X number available, that they have some auction value, not that I would want us to take them and then auction them and make revenue off of this deal. But the question raises in my mind, what are some alternative uses? Say we don't decide to use these to house people in because of our building safety codes and other concerns. We have talked about needing to establish food caches for safety and other alternative uses for space. Maybe because this is in the conversation of the navigation center and the purpose-built structure, that if we do get to functional 0, we might have an alternative use, which is to be prepared for other important scenarios. So has there been contemplated other possible uses for these structures?
One of the things that Mr. Wilbanks had mentioned was, obviously when we do camp abatements, if we get to that point, or when we do housing, we need a place to store people's personal belongings. There's probably that option as well. That would require very little retrofitting to these structures. Other than that, Larry, have you thought of any other locations?
Mr. Johnson, Jim, I think I reflect on a couple things over my history, that we always have needs to places to store things, and we always have a continuing change in the community, just like the food bank approach. There's always a change. And I remember a few years ago that we had a warehouse out on Mountain View Drive that it was just overflowing. We did, and it's costing us to rent that building every time that every month. And so I think, Mr. Constant, you're on the right track, frankly, because if it for some reason everything happens exactly the way that we please, then is there a future? Is there a future need? I suspect that there would be. I remember over off of Tudor Road, and we stored the Adam
Documents.
uh,
Well,
the,
planning documents.
the planning documents and the road those rubber things we used to put across the road before we started putting asphalt. Why we were keeping them, I have no idea, but we're paying every month to store them. So I think you're 100% correct that if this windfall that the school board is willing to give us, if this isn't the long-term use, you probably have multiple options as to, we could reduce costs of other facilities that we store things in, or we could, like you suggested, we could auction it off and we have money to do something that we need to do. I think it's endless, but you have the opportunity.
Yeah, I don't. I heard some stories about the possibility of code change requests for RV camping in Girdwood, right? And we hear lots about folks in Girdwood in the short term having no place for workforce housing. If these are functional for housing, maybe it's not a homelessness response, maybe it's something else.
Yeah.
And anyhow, so to me, this vehicle might not be the right thing, but those structures might have a use.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Baker, you mentioned that you knew someone or had talked to someone that had 6 bathroom and showers that could be installed in these buildings. And were they going to donate those, or were those going to be for sale?
Mr. Peterson, no, not, we could purchase them or we could rent them. And they're self-contained. They don't go inside the building. They would sit next, like if you had a U shape and you wanted to have 1 or 2 self-contained units that would sit and service those 5 or 6 or however many buildings. And these are facilities that are actually ordered by ConocoPhillips to go to the slope. And then there was the project that they were brought in for was slowed down. And so the facility, the units are sitting here in Anchorage. And again, there's been so much publicity that they just called on the phone and said, hey, we've got these self-contained shower and bathroom units that we were sending to the slope. Do you have a need? And so, it's amazing when you start talking to the public and people, and it's like the freight carrier coming in saying, hey, we want to do our part to help. We'll move those buildings for you and we won't charge you. So it's kind of cool.
Right. Just a quick follow, if I might. Thank you. And so obviously the question about these relocatables is where would they be put? What location would they be moved to? But what if one of the nonprofit partners that's involved in trying to solve this problem had a location for 1 or 2 of those? Do you think the school district would be willing to donate it to a nonprofit as well?
I think that's certainly a conversation we can have. And, again, the school district realizes that there's challenges associated with homelessness and wants to be part of a solution. And I have a hard time believing that they'd say no to anything. I don't want to speak for them, but that's obviously something that we will bring up with them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. So I have to admit, coming off of our earlier meeting with the school district when we talked about the gap the budget gap they're facing, thought, I assumed that maybe these didn't have a tremendously high value when they said they would be donating them, not looking a gift horse in the mouth. I wish that the gap was easily solved by auctioning off some relocatables, I guess I would say. But I think like the school district probably also has some cost data, and maybe they've already shared that with you, but I think members would be interested in seeing just for like electrical costs, heating costs, maintenance costs.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, they're all electric heating, and yes, we asked that very same question: what is the cost? And we can provide that to you, and I'm happy to. but again, going back to question number one, it takes a code change in order for us to utilize these buildings. So we want to be upfront, forthright, and then you could make the decision. And if you think it's something, and I think that they are looking this as a cost saver, because I think when they do sit behind the buildings, they probably are paying the electricity to keep them warm. And so this is probably part of their overall financial review of it not only might help us in the city for a possible solution, but it helped them in reducing costs. And the other 33, they might just auction off as revenue. I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. I wanted to just add on about egress. And I know this is an issue that came up. I mean, my kids have been in portable, relocatable classrooms, and the ones that have just one door, sometimes during the winter when they're shifting, the door becomes difficult to open. And I know that has been a parent concern sometimes, being able to have a secondary door. Of course, you might presume that door might also have some shifting, but anyway, I just wanted to also stress that piece that it has already been brought up, but the ones that have two doors definitely would be preferred.
They all will have to have two doors. But if they don't have, if the ones that they want to give to us, if you should accept, they will all have to have two doors. It will not be an option.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members? All right, I don't see any others. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to have this conversation. It's always nice to be able to ask questions without the pressure of being right there on the dais. So thank you for that, Mr. Trombley. With that, this is our final work session of the day. So have a great weekend, everyone. We are adjourned. Thank you so much.